When my daughter-in-law slapped me across the face in front of 200 wedding guests, my own son just stood there and watched. For a few seconds, I couldn't even process the sound. The music stopped, the chatter froze, and I just stood there, my hands still pressed against my cheek, feeling the warmth where her palm had landed. My name is Clara Voss, and that moment, that single public act of humiliation, shattered something inside me that had been fragile for too long. The slap wasn't just anger. It was the final physical proof of years of small cruelties, of smirks disguised as jokes, of my son's silences that spoke louder than his words. But the cruelest part wasn't her hand, it was his eyes. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't defend me, didn't even look away. He just watched, his jaw tight, his arm resting on Julia's waist, as if he'd already decided which side he belonged to. The crowd began to whisper. My relatives stared, frozen between shock and gossip, their wine glasses halfway to their lips. Someone laughed nervously, as though it were all part of the show. Julia's mother muttered something about old people being dramatic. And that was it. Laughter rippled through the tables. That laughter cut deeper than the slap. I remember trying to steady myself, to keep my dignity intact. I was wearing my late husband's pearl brooch that day, a small thing, but it felt like armor. He would have hated this. He would have stepped between us, silenced everyone, demanded respect. But he was gone, and all I had left was a son who let his wife turn me into a spectacle. Julia hissed something through her smile. "You should have stayed out of this, Clara. You've embarrassed us enough." Her tone was honeyed poison. I wanted to scream, to demand why she thought I was the one embarrassing anyone. But all I could do was walk away, holding what was left of my pride together like cracked porcelain. As I moved toward the exit, I caught my reflection in a mirror. Red eyes, streaked mascara, a trembling lip. I didn't recognize that woman. That wasn't the Clara who built a home from nothing, who raised Daniel alone after his father's illness took everything from us. That wasn't the woman who paid for his education, his first car, his business loan, all of it. That was a stranger, broken by her own child's silence. When I got home, the silence felt heavier than usual. I poured myself a glass of water, stared at my trembling hands, and asked out loud, why did I let it get this far? The walls didn't answer, but I could feel the weight of every compromise I'd made for Daniel's happiness pressing down on me. Every time I'd forgiven his neglect, every time I'd smiled through Julia's little digs, all to keep the peace. Peace, I realized, had only ever existed for them, not for me. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment, over and over. The slap, the stares, the laughter. I thought about calling Daniel, demanding an apology, but deep down, I already knew what he'd say. That I overreacted, that Julia was stressed, that I misunderstood. He had learned to gaslight me without even knowing the word for it. So, instead, I opened my old filing cabinet, the one with my late husband's ledgers, the papers nobody ever asked about. My husband, Richard Voss, had left behind more than memories. Decades ago, we built quiet wealth, properties, stocks, businesses, all under a private trust. I'd lived modestly since his death because money had never meant power to me. But that night, for the first time in years, I realized it could. As I looked through those documents, something in me shifted from sorrow to resolute. Julia and Daniel had no idea how much I truly controlled. They thought I was just an aging widow in a small apartment. They didn't know that every rent payment they made went to a company I still owned. They didn't know the credit cards Julia flaunted were funded by the very trust I had managed in secret. They didn't know, but soon they would. What would you have done in my place? Walked away quietly? Or started planning the kind of revenge that doesn't shout, it waits, watches, and strikes when no one expects it?
The morning after the wedding, the world outside looked calm, bright, ordinary, almost mocking. But inside, I felt hollowed out. I sat by the window, watching the sunlight spill across my kitchen table, wondering how something as simple as daylight could feel so cruel. I half expected Daniel to call, to ask if I was all right, to apologize for what happened. He didn't. By the third day, I realized he never would. Instead, I received a text, short, cold, and formal. Julia and I need to talk about your living situation. Can we come by this weekend? My living situation. Those words hit harder than any slap. When they arrived, Julia walked in like she owned the place. High heels clicking, sunglasses still on, perfume filling the air before her voice did. Daniel trailed behind her like a shadow, silent, uneasy. I could tell by the way he avoided my eyes that this conversation wasn't his idea, at least not entirely. Clara, Julia began, her tone rehearsed, her smile wide enough to hide the venom. You've been living here alone for years now, and we just think it's time you had more privacy. Privacy? I repeated slowly. Or distance. She didn't flinch. It's just, we're starting a family soon. We want space. The apartment you have is perfect for us. The location, the schools nearby, the neighborhood. You don't really need such a big place, do you? Daniel shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "It's just a suggestion, Mom." A suggestion. They wanted my home. The same home my husband and I built. Every inch of it filled with memories. Birthdays, holidays, our last anniversary dinner before his heart failed him in the living room. I could still see the candle wax stain on the table from that night. Julia leaned forward, lowering her voice like she was offering me charity. We found a lovely senior complex not far from here. Really comfortable, with medical support. You'll have company, activities, everything you need. I looked at her, studying her perfectly painted face, the practiced kindness in her tone. I said quietly, "You mean you want me out?" Julia sighed, pretending disappointment. "Clara, it's not like that. We just want what's best for everyone." But her eyes told the truth. This wasn't about what was best for everyone. It was about control, about ownership, about erasing me from the life I had built so she could occupy the space where I once belonged. Daniel stayed quiet. I turned to him, hoping for a flicker of the boy I raised, the one who used to bring me daisies from the garden. I said softly, "Daniel, is this what you want too?" He hesitated, eyes darting toward Julia, then back at me. He said, "It's just temporary, Mom. You'll like it there. You deserve a break." A break. As if I'd been working for them my entire life and finally earned time off. I smiled faintly, more to myself than to them. "Of course," I said, steady, but heart cracking. "If that's what you both think." Julia grinned, relieved, and stood up. "Wonderful. I knew you'd understand." When they left, I sat there for a long while, staring at the empty teacups they'd left behind. Hers, still half full, lipstick stain on the rim. His, untouched. That tiny detail broke me more than her words. My son couldn't even take a sip of tea in my home anymore. That evening, I walked through every room, touching the walls, the furniture, the photos. I stopped at a framed picture of Daniel when he was 10, missing a tooth, covered in dirt from baseball practice, smiling up at me with pure joy. I whispered, "Where did you go, my boy?" The silence was my only answer. Days turned into weeks, and the manipulation became routine. Julia would call with feigned concern, "Clara, are you eating properly?" Or send pamphlets for senior living communities that looked more like luxury cages. She dropped phrases like safety, mental rest, less responsibility, all dressed up as care, all meant to make me feel small, fragile, irrelevant. But I wasn't the fragile one. Not anymore. One afternoon, I went through my safe deposit box. Old property titles, company shares, investment records. Everything Richard and I had built was still under my control, quietly, invisibly. I realized then how ironic it was. Julia and Daniel were trying to take from me what I had already given them access to in disguise. The apartment they wanted so badly, owned by one of my shell companies. The business Daniel claimed as his, funded by the same trust they assumed was empty. They thought they were playing me. They didn't realize I'd written the rules of this game long before Julia ever learned how to lie with a smile. Still, I didn't move too soon. Revenge needs patience. It needs to grow quietly, beneath the surface, until it's too late to stop it. So, I played along. I smiled through their visits, nodded at their plans, pretended to consider the senior community, and when Julia left her designer purse on my counter one afternoon, I saw something that confirmed what I already suspected: a thick folder labeled Voss Holdings Proposal. She wasn't just trying to move me out, she was trying to take everything. That night, I sat in my study with the folder in front of me, my glasses perched on the edge of my nose, reading every word of her plan. It was detailed, frighteningly so. They wanted to declare me mentally unfit to handle my finances, transfer power of attorney to Daniel, and gain full control of my assets for my protection. I remember whispering into the darkness, "So that's your game." And for the first time in years, I smiled. Not out of kindness, but out of something sharper, because now I had all the proof I needed. What would you have done if your own children plotted to steal your life's work under the mask of concern? Would you confront them or wait and let their greed expose itself in public?
The next morning, I stood in front of my mirror and realized something had changed. My face looked the same. Tired eyes, faint lines, the faint mark of that humiliating slap barely visible now. But something behind those eyes had shifted. The grief that used to live there had turned into focus. For years, I'd lived small on purpose. Richard and I had made that decision together after his first heart attack. He said, "Clara, money is only power when no one knows you have it." And I listened. I wore the same modest clothes, kept the same small apartment, shopped at the same grocery store where the cashier knew me by name. To everyone else, I was a lonely widow scraping by. But that illusion had protected me for decades. Now, it was time to use it. I went to my old mahogany desk, the one Daniel used to do his homework on, and opened the hidden drawer at the bottom, the one even he never knew about. Inside were 3 worn leather folders and an envelope labeled Voss Private. My hands didn't tremble this time when I opened them. Inside was the map of everything I owned. 8 rental properties scattered across the city, 2 shell companies registered under names Richard and I created before our marriage, a modest stake in a logistics firm, and the crown jewel, a trust account under Vanguard Voss Foundation, valued at over $11 million, designed to bypass direct inheritance and activate only under my authorization. For years, I let Daniel believe I lived on a pension. He never questioned it. Why would he? I let him feel superior, successful. It kept the peace. But as I sat there, reviewing the paperwork, I realized peace had only protected them, never me. That afternoon, I called Carlos Mendes, an old friend of Richard's,
a quiet, brilliant man who had helped manage our estate back when we still believed in family loyalty. When he picked up, his voice was warm and calm. "Clara, it's been too long." I said, "Carlos, I think it's time we open the vault." He went silent for a beat, then said softly, "What happened?" I replied, "Family happened." We met the next day in his private office. Oak shelves, brass lamps, the faint smell of old paper and confidence. I told him everything. The slap, the humiliation, the apartment scheme, the plan to declare me mentally unfit. He listened quietly, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I finished, he simply said, "You've been too kind for too long." I smiled faintly. "Kindness is expensive, Carlos. I'm ready to stop paying for it." He nodded. "Then let's prepare. We'll need to review your assets, tighten your legal framework, and gather evidence. When they move, we'll already be 2 steps ahead." For the first time since Richard's death, I felt something close to peace. Not the false peace of silence, but the kind that comes when you finally decide to stop being the victim. Over the next few weeks, Carlos and I worked quietly. I transferred certain assets under new holding names. I liquidated smaller accounts and funneled them into secure trusts. We drafted legal documents that made it nearly impossible for anyone to challenge my mental capacity or seize control without public hearings. And all the while, I kept smiling in front of Daniel and Julia. I played the fragile widow perfectly. Hesitant, confused, even forgetful at times. It made Julia overconfident. She started talking more, letting small pieces of her real intentions slip through her syrupy tone. One afternoon, while pretending to help me organize my bills, she laughed and said, "You know, Clara, when people get older, they sometimes make irrational choices with money. It's good that Daniel's around to keep you safe." I looked up from the papers, pretending to be naive. "You mean safe from myself?" She smirked. "From mistakes." I smiled sweetly. "Oh, darling, I stopped making mistakes the day I met you." She didn't catch the sting in my words. She thought I was soft, harmless. That was her mistake. At night, I'd sit on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. I thought about how easily people like Julia used charm as a weapon, how they disguised greed as love. She wasn't the first person to underestimate me, but she'd be the last. Carlos once told me, revenge, when done right, isn't about anger. It's about restoration, of dignity, of truth, of control. I repeated those words like a prayer. But revenge also needs patience. Every move I made had to look accidental, every transfer invisible, every decision disguised as weakness. I let Daniel believe I was preparing to move into the senior complex Julia had found. I even visited once, walked through the halls, smiled at the nurses, made notes about the food. I wanted her to think I'd given up. But while Julia slept beside my son in their expensive home, the one I quietly owned through an intermediary trust, I was setting the stage for the truth to collapse on top of them. And yet, even as I planned, part of me still hoped Daniel would see through her, that he'd come back to me as the boy who once hugged me and said, "Mom, you're my hero." But heroes grow old, and sons forget their stories when someone else starts writing them. So I decided I'd remind him, not with words, but with a lesson he'd never forget. The night before I executed the first step, I wrote in my journal, "They took my silence for weakness. Tomorrow, they'll learn it was strategy." Tell me honestly, would you have revealed your cards early or waited, letting them believe they had already won?
It's strange, isn't it? How betrayal doesn't always come like a thunderclap. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, like a slow leak, until one day you realize the foundation beneath you has rotted away. That's how I felt the morning I found out Daniel had taken a second mortgage on his house. The same house I had secretly financed years ago. I only discovered it because one of my property accountants sent a notice for a title verification. When I read his name on the loan documents, I felt the air leave my lungs. He hadn't come to me for help. He hadn't even told me. I went straight to Carlos. He scanned the papers, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. These are dangerous loans, Clara. High interest, short term, tied to your company's property. If they default, your trust is exposed. My company? I whispered. You mean they used... Yes, he interrupted gently. They leveraged your assets without realizing it. Or maybe they realized it perfectly. I sat there for a long time, staring at the floor. My mind raced through every dinner, every phone call, every moment Daniel had avoided talking about money. He used to come to me for advice, for help, for everything. Now he was using me, in secret. Carlos watched me carefully. Clara, you know what this means. I nodded slowly. It means he's chosen his side. A few days later, I decided to see him. I didn't call ahead. I just showed up at his office. His secretary hesitated when she saw me, but she didn't stop me. I walked right in. Daniel was sitting behind his desk, typing furiously, his tie loosened, his eyes tired. For a brief moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. Mom, he said, startled. You should have called. I wanted to surprise you, I said softly. Seems you've been full of surprises yourself. He frowned. What do you mean? I took a seat, folded my hands, and placed the loan papers on his desk. His face drained of color. Where did you get these? He asked quietly. From the same company you borrowed against. Daniel, you used my holdings. You tied my assets to your debt. Did you think I wouldn't find out? He rubbed his forehead, avoiding my eyes. It's temporary. I just needed liquidity for a few projects. Julia and you have already taken enough. You've taken my home, my dignity, and now you're taking my name. Mom, it's not like that, he insisted, his voice tight with frustration. You don't understand how business works. I laughed, quietly, bitterly. Daniel, I taught you how business works. I signed your first contract. I read your first proposal. Don't tell me I don't understand. Tell me why you thought you could betray me. He leaned back, sighing, like I was the one being unreasonable. Because, Mom, you don't need all that money. You live like a ghost. You don't travel, you don't spend, you don't even enjoy it. Julia and I have plans, real ones. A new venture, investments, maybe a bigger home. You've had your life. Let us have ours. For a moment, the world blurred. He didn't even sound ashamed, just entitled, as if everything I'd ever earned belonged to him by default. I stared at him. This man, who used to bring me flowers on my birthday, who once cried when his father died, who promised he'd always protect me. Now, he was the one holding the knife. Daniel, I said softly, you're not stealing money. You're stealing respect. You're stealing love. And one day, you'll realize those are much harder to repay. He looked away. I don't want to fight. You already started it, I whispered. When I left his office, my hands were trembling, but not from sadness anymore. The sadness was gone, burned away by something colder, sharper, a sense of clarity. For the first time, I saw him not as my son, but as a man shaped by greed and weakness. Julia hadn't just manipulated him, she'd hollowed him out, filled him with her own ambition. That night, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every memory of Daniel was now colored by betrayal. His laugh, his hugs, the way he once said, "I'll always be your boy, Mom." Lies. All of it. By dawn, I knew what had to be done. Revenge wasn't just about them anymore. It was about reclaiming every piece of myself they'd chipped away. I called Carlos. "It's time," I said simply. He didn't ask what I meant. He just said, "I'll prepare everything." Over the next few weeks, we began gathering evidence, quietly, surgically. Every transaction, every forged signature, every debt tied to my properties. I wanted it all on record. I didn't want to destroy Daniel with rage. I wanted to destroy him with truth. Still, I found myself looking at his childhood photos sometimes. The small boy with scraped knees and bright eyes who used to run to me after every little victory. I'd whisper, "I'm sorry, my love, but you left me no choice." Because betrayal is a strange thing. It doesn't just end love. It rewrites it. It turns every memory into evidence, every moment into motive. And mine were about to become ammunition. Tell me, if it were your own child, would you still go through with it, or would you let love stop you from justice?
We started like surgeons, quiet, methodical, precise. Carlos brought in a woman I'd only met once at a memorial service, a forensic accountant named Evelyn Cho, who smelled faintly of jasmine and confidence. Evelyn had a way of looking at numbers like they were people. She could see guilt in a ledger the way some see guilt in a face. When she agreed to help, she did it with the same calm certainty that had steadied me through so many storms. "You don't want fireworks," she told me the first day. "You want a clean burn. Paper trails, timestamps, email headers. If it can be documented, it can be proven." We set up in Carlos's office like a small, secret task force. Carlos handled the legal scaffolding. Evelyn dug through the transactions. I became the historian, remembering conversations, finding dates, collecting memories that now read like alibis. We made lists, cross-referenced bank transfers, subpoenaed corporate records under quiet pretenses, and followed the money, the same way a detective follows footprints in the snow. At first, the trail was messy. A $5,000 transfer here, a suspicious invoice there, but Evelyn started to connect the dots. A landscaping company that never did landscaping, a furniture vendor that existed only on paper, payments funneled through a web of LLCs registered in neighboring states. And then the ugliest thing, a pattern of cash withdrawals timed to times when my own accounts showed maintenance fees. Tiny at first, then balloons, then dangerous spikes. "There," Evelyn said one night, tapping her screen until the numbers glowed. "Look at this. 2 payments to a private lender in 6 months. The interest is astronomical. They're gambling with your holdings." Carlos leaned back, expression hardening. "This isn't mere poor judgment. This is deliberate leverage." We followed the money to a collection of shell companies with names like Red Maple Logistics and Crescent Harbor LLC, names chosen to sound respectable. Through a quiet court filing and a friendly investigator, we found a contract linking Crescent Harbor to a loan broker named Marcus Hale, a man known for making problems disappear for the right price. Marcus didn't operate in daylight, and his presence in the papers was a shadow that stretched across several bad deals. As we dug deeper, the personal sting grew sharper. Documents showed Julia had been signing papers in my name, small, seemingly harmless consents that had slowly bled authority away from me, a notarized form here, an approval there, Someone had been grooming the paper trail for the exact moment they'd claim I couldn't manage anymore. "You see why they wanted you moved," Evelyn said softly one evening. "If they control your body, they control the signature. If they control the signature, they control everything." It made the plan behind the slap look surgical: humiliation to soften witnesses, removal to isolate, paperwork to seize power. It was ugly in its efficiency, but we had found something even more dangerous: a backdoor into one of the holding accounts that only opened on a biometric trigger. Daniel had bragged once about the high-end security my son's business used, the same tech that would have seemed harmless, except one line in an old email revealed who originally set it up: Richard's company. My fingerprints were in the system. That meant access, if we could prove chain of custody. It also meant a way to lock them out, if we acted smart. We began building the case like a fortress. Carlos filed restraining documents and protective motions under urgency seal. Evelyn prepared forensic reports with timestamps and IP logs. I gathered witnesses: former contractors who'd been ghosted out of payments, a neighbor who'd seen a late-night meeting at Daniel's house, a bank clerk who remembered an unusually nervous signature. I reached out, quietly, to Maya, my niece, who worked in a small media outlet, not to make noise, but to prepare a timeline, someone I could trust to spread truth if we ever needed the court of public opinion. Maya agreed, eyes wide but steady, the way only the young can be when they feel a righteous fire. There were close calls. Once, Julia called me one afternoon, sweet, casual, as if she'd never lifted a hand to my face. "We heard you've been asking questions," she said, voice light as porcelain. "Be careful, Mom. You're going down a dangerous path."
I realized then that they had noticed the first small tremors. Someone at their end had seen a subpoena. They were looking. My blood ran cold for a second, and then hot. That threat only proved Evelyn was right. This was real. They were scared. We were getting under their skin. We set a trap next. Evelyn flagged an account we suspected to be their laundering hub and left a false trail, a test transfer that would ping the hidden endpoints. If someone siphoned it, we'd have a live wire to follow. 2 nights later, the wire flickered. Someone moved the funds. The trail lit up in the logs like fireflies. IP addresses, timestamps, a late-night transfer authorized from Daniel's device. Carlos sat in the dim office and didn't say much. He typed a single note and printed it. Evidence of fraud, chain of authorization established. He slid it across the table to me, like a verdict wrapped in paper. I thought of Daniel, in his childhood pajamas, of scraped knees and earnest promises. The image cut me like frost. But alongside that frost was a fierce, bright clarity. Betrayal, when mapped, looks less like pain and more like a blueprint. It tells you where to go next. We kept moving. We filed injunctions to freeze certain accounts. We prepared to serve papers that would force a public accounting. And we rehearsed for the moment they'd tried to gaslight their way out. For the courtroom moments, the shouting, the attempts to paint me as the irrational matriarch hoarding funds. For every gaslight, we had a log. For every story they'd tell, we had receipts, timestamps, emails, and witnesses. But while the legal machinery chugged, Julia escalated in quieter, crueler ways. A brick through my window at midnight, a deliberately misplaced medication, a voicemail left on my phone with static and someone breathing on the other end. She wanted me off balance, shaky, to create the very instability they'd claim in court. It was childish and dangerous. It made the stakes personal in ways even the ledgers couldn't capture. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Carlos and Evelyn, the files spread like a battlefield map. I looked at their faces, his steady, her precise, and felt not fear, but readiness. I said, "Tomorrow, we take the first cut." Would you have kept your hands in your lap, waiting for justice to find you? Or would you, like me, prepare every proof, plan every step, and make sure the truth landed like a hammer? The first sign that they were cornered wasn't a lawsuit or a phone call. It was silence. Weeks passed with no word from Daniel or Julia. No fake apologies, no sarcastic texts, no family updates. Silence. The kind that hums in your bones because it's not peace, it's preparation. Carlos called it the calm before the legal storm. I called it the breath before the scream. The day the papers arrived, the mailman didn't even look at me. He just handed over a thick envelope with too many seals on it. Inside, I found my worst fear written in legal jargon. A petition claiming that I was mentally unfit to manage my own finances. Daniel and Julia had filed it jointly, claiming concern for my cognitive decline and citing paranoid behavior, erratic spending, and delusional accusations. Delusional accusations. That phrase cut deeper than the slap ever did. Carlos read the papers 3 times before looking up. He said, "They're using the guardianship loophole. If a judge believes this, you could lose control over every asset, every account, even your medical choices." I laughed, a quiet, bitter sound. So that's what all the false concern was about. They were laying groundwork. And then Julia made her next move. She went public. She called relatives, friends, even people from the neighborhood, crying about how worried she was for me. She painted herself as the loving daughter-in-law trying to help an old woman who was losing touch with reality. Every word she spoke was coated in honey, but underneath, it was poison. Soon, messages started pouring in. "Clara, are you okay? We heard you've been confused lately. Maybe you should take a break from handling things." It was working. The gaslight was spreading like wildfire. One night, as rain tapped against my windows, I sat alone reading the petition again and again. Every lie on that paper felt like a theft, not just of my money, but of my identity. For a moment, I thought about giving it all, just to be free. But then I remembered the slap, the laughter, the silence from my own son.
No. They had taken my dignity once. They wouldn't take it again. The next morning, I called Carlos and said, "File the counterclaim. All of it. I want them exposed in open court." But Carlos, ever the tactician, said, "Let's go one better. Let's make sure when they fall, everyone sees how they built their lies." That's when Evelyn came back with her final report. A thick folder full of bank statements, forged documents, fraudulent loans, and messages between Julia and Marcus Hale discussing how to accelerate guardianship. Proof of conspiracy. And then fate, as if in agreement, handed us something bigger. Evelyn found an email thread, Daniel's old correspondence with their loan officer, showing that they had pledged my apartment as collateral, without my consent. The legal description, my fake signature, the notary stamp, the evidence was damning. We had them, but we needed the world to see it. That's when I called Maya, my niece. She had been quietly documenting everything, not for gossip, but for the record. "It's time," I told her. "You'll get the full story soon. Just be ready." A week later, Julia pushed harder. She arrived at my apartment uninvited, flanked by her mother and a so-called social worker. They stood in the doorway like a tribunal. "Clara, this is just a wellness check. We're worried about you. You've been so isolated." I looked her in the eye. "You mean strategic silence? Don't confuse my calm with weakness." Her smile tightened. "We're trying to help, but if you make this difficult, the court will intervene. You won't like how that feels." That was her mistake, threatening me in my own doorway. I turned to the so-called social worker who was clutching a clipboard like a shield. Did you tell you that they're under financial investigation? That they forged a notary? Maybe you'd like to see the documentation. Julia froze. The color drained from her face. She hadn't expected me to have evidence or confidence. When they left, I called Carlos. They just came to my door with an ultimatum. He chuckled grimly. Then it's time for ours. We'll give them a ballroom and an audience. I knew exactly what he meant. Daniel and Julia's company was hosting an anniversary gala soon. A grand affair full of investors, relatives, and the very people they'd fooled for years. That night, Carlos laid the plan on the table. Meticulous. Surgical. We would gather every document, every file, every signature, and expose them under the same chandeliers where they once toasted their perfect marriage. I could almost see it, the glittering crowd, the fake smiles, the shock as truth replaced performance. I didn't crave vengeance. I craved balance, the kind of justice that leaves no room for denial. I sat back, the city lights flickering through my window. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt ready. Let them bring their lies. I'll bring the truth. And that's how the final act began. Not with rage, but with precision. The storm was coming, and this time, I wasn't hiding. Tell me, if you were standing in my shoes, knowing your own son had signed your freedom away for money, would you still hold back? Would you forgive? Or would you wait for the perfect moment to turn every falsehood into fire?
The ballroom shimmered like a lie dressed in gold. Every chandelier sparkled. Every table was dressed in white silk and false laughter. It was Daniel and Julia's anniversary gala, the one they'd bragged about for months. The event was meant to showcase their flourishing family business and their commitment to community. In reality, it was a monument to illusion, one last performance before the curtain fell. Carlos stood beside me near the back entrance, adjusting his tie with surgical precision. He said, "Remember, no outbursts, no drama. Let the evidence speak. You'll have your moment." I nodded, though my hands trembled slightly inside my gloves. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper, the vibration of years of humiliation, grief, and restraint finally meeting its reckoning. When I stepped inside, heads turned. Not out of love, out of curiosity. You could almost hear the whisper ripple through the crowd. She came? I thought they weren't speaking to her. Poor thing, she's losing it. Julia was radiant in gold satin, the very picture of charm and victory. Daniel, at his side, wore that polite smile he inherited from his father, the same one he used when he lied as a boy. When Julia saw me, her face flickered. Surprise, then annoyance, then that practiced mask of warmth. "Mother!" she exclaimed loudly enough for the microphones to catch. "What a wonderful surprise! Everyone, this is my dear mother-in-law, Clara." Her voice dripped sugar, but her eyes burned daggers. I smiled gently. "Dear, I wouldn't have missed it for the world." The event carried on, champagne glasses clinking, cameras flashing. They were so proud of their spectacle, speeches about success, charity, and family. When Daniel took the stage to thank his beloved wife for her unwavering support, the room melted into applause. That's when Carlos caught my eye from across the room and gave a small nod. It was time. I walked to the stage slowly, heels echoing against marble. Every sound in the room seemed to stretch, as though time itself held its breath. Daniel paused, unsure, microphone in hand. "Mother, now's not really—" "Actually," I said softly, taking the microphone from him with steady hand, "now is exactly the right time." You could feel the air shift.
Cameras turned, guests straightened in their chairs. "For years," I began, voice calm and even, "I believed that love, loyalty, and trust were enough to protect a family. But tonight, I've learned something far more important, that silence can be a weapon and dignity can be armor." Julia laughed nervously. "She's been under a lot of stress lately." "Stress?" I turned to her. "Would that be before or after you filed false petitions declaring me mentally unfit, or before you forged my signature to use my home as collateral for your debts?" The laughter died instantly. The crowd went still. Carlos stepped forward and placed a folder on the podium. "These," he announced, his lawyer's voice cutting through the murmurs, "are certified bank records, forged documents, and recorded communications proving a pattern of financial exploitation and fraud, all filed this morning in court." Julia's face drained of color. Daniel's jaw fell open. "Mom," he whispered, "you don't understand." "Oh, I understand," I said, my voice trembling only with truth. "I understand that you stood beside the woman who humiliated me in public and said nothing. I understand that you let her use my home, my money, and my name while telling people I was losing my mind. But the only thing I've lost," I paused, letting the silence deepen, "is patience." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones came out. Someone started filming. Julia tried to lunge for the documents, but Evelyn, calm, graceful Evelyn, stepped between her and the podium. "Touch those, and you'll add obstruction to your list," she said, voice like ice. Cameras flashed. Someone shouted Daniel's name. A reporter, I recognized her as one of Maya's contacts, whispered into her mic, "Breaking news, allegations of elder financial abuse at prominent family business event." The downfall began in real time. Daniel backed away from the stage, hands shaking. Julia, wild-eyed, turned to the guests. "This is ridiculous! She's delusional! She's—" Carlos interrupted sharply. "Save it for the court. The injunction's already been granted. Accounts are frozen as of 6 p.m. tonight." The ballroom exploded into noise, shock, whispers, disbelief. But through it all, I just stood there, the microphone still in my hand. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt peaceful. I looked at Daniel one last time. My son, the boy I once rocked to sleep. I told him quietly, "You could have had everything. You only had to be kind." He looked at me with tears in his eyes, but no words came. Maybe there weren't any left that could fix what he'd done. I stepped down from the stage and walked through the crowd. No one stopped me. Some people whispered my name like a prayer. Others just moved aside. Outside, the night air felt like freedom. Cold, honest, alive. Carlos caught up to me near the exit. "It's done," he said. I exhaled, long and slow. I said, "No, it's just beginning." Because revenge wasn't just about retribution. It was about rebuilding, about making sure no one else would suffer the same silent theft of dignity that I had. I looked back once at the glittering room now cracking apart under the weight of truth, and felt something like closure. Tell me, honestly, if you'd been the one standing at that podium, would you have spoken? Or would you have stayed silent, letting the world keep believing the prettier version of your pain? The morning after the gala felt unreal, like waking up in a house that had survived a hurricane. Everything was still standing, but nothing was the same. News outlets had already picked up the footage. One video, shaky and raw, taken from someone's phone, showed me standing at the podium, confronting Daniel and Julia. It had gone viral overnight. The caption read, "Elderly woman exposes her son and daughter-in-law's financial abuse at luxury gala. Some commenters called me brave, others called me ruthless. But for once, the story wasn't being told for me. It was being told about them." Carlos arrived early that morning, legal pad in hand, his eyes heavy but satisfied. He said, "The judge reviewed the emergency filings. The injunction holds. Their accounts are frozen. The property is protected under your name again." I nodded, though I could hardly process it. "And Daniel?" Carlos hesitated. "He's cooperating, for now. But Julia's been trying to spin the story. Her mother called a press conference this morning claiming you're being manipulated by outsiders." I almost laughed. They still think reputation is their currency. Let them trade it till it's worthless. Later that day, I met Evelyn at a small cafe, our unofficial war room. She placed a folder in front of me, thinner this time. "The audit's finished. Everything's been turned over to the authorities. You can finally breathe." Breathe. It sounded so simple, but after months of tension, I wasn't sure I remembered how. Outside, the world was moving on. Cars rushing past, people laughing, life unfolding as if nothing had happened. Yet inside me, everything was rearranging itself. Relief, grief, a strange, heavy quiet where anger used to live. That night, Daniel showed up at my apartment. Not to apologize, not really. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie gone, his voice cracked from crying. "Mom," he said, barely above a whisper, "you destroyed us." I looked at him for a long time. "No, Daniel. I uncovered what you destroyed yourself." He looked away, shame flickering across his face. "We were desperate. Julia said it was temporary. She said you'd be safer if I didn't own my own life? If I didn't know what you were doing behind my back? Don't call that safety. Call it what it was. Greed wrapped in justification." He sank onto the couch, hands covering his face. "I didn't know she forged things. I swear I didn't." I wanted to believe him. God, a part of me still did. But love can't overwrite evidence. "I would have forgiven almost anything," I said quietly. But standing there that night, letting her slap me in front of everyone and saying nothing, that silence said everything. He started to speak, then stopped. There were no words left that could undo years of betrayal. When he left, I stood at the window, watching the taillights fade. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like surgery. Necessary. Painful. Final. Over the next few weeks, everything unraveled for them. Julia was served with fraud and conspiracy charges. Her company imploded as investors pulled out. Daniel's business accounts were audited. Creditors came knocking. The same people who had once toasted their success now avoided their calls. There's a strange justice in watching liars choke on their own lies, not because it's joyful, but because it restores balance. Still, not everything was triumph. Family friends stopped calling. Some relatives whispered that I had gone too far. The ones who'd stayed silent during my humiliation now wanted to stay neutral. It's funny how morality gets quiet when truth gets loud. But there were others, people I didn't expect, who reached out. A woman named Mrs. Dalton, who'd seen her own children strip her of her savings, called to say, "You gave me courage to fight back." A stranger mailed me a letter that simply read, "You made me believe I'm not crazy for standing up for myself." Those messages mattered more than the applause. Evelyn, ever calm, helped me sort through the aftermath, reclaiming accounts, settling debts, redirecting funds. Carlos filed for damages, and slowly, the noise began to fade. For the first time in years, I started sleeping through the night. No more footsteps in the hall, no more whispers behind closed doors. Just quiet. But one evening, as I sat alone with a cup of tea, I caught myself thinking, how had it come to this? A mother destroying her own son in court? A family torn apart by greed? Would things have been different if I had confronted them sooner, or if I had just walked away quietly instead of fighting back? Then I remembered Julia's smirk, the slap, the word delusional. No, walking away would have meant surrender. And survival isn't surrender, it's self-respect, wearing scars. So I poured another cup and whispered into the empty room, "They took my peace for years. I'm just taking it back." And in that moment, I realized revenge wasn't about winning. It was about ending. Tell me, if it had been your own blood that betrayed you for money, could you still find forgiveness? Or would you, like me, find peace only when truth finally stood where love had fallen? In the quiet months that followed the storm, something unexpected happened. Peace. Not the kind that comes from escape, but the kind that comes from surviving your own collapse, began to root. I would wake up early, sunlight brushing across my curtains, and for the first time in years, I didn't dread the day. The apartment that once felt like a cage now felt like a sanctuary. The silence that used to sting now sounded like safety. But peace alone wasn't enough. After everything, I needed meaning. It started with a letter. A woman named Agnes Rivers wrote me from Michigan. Her daughter had tricked her into signing over her home, then abandoned her when the money dried up. She'd seen my story on the news. Her handwriting trembled across the paper. "You showed me that we don't have to disappear quietly." That line sat with me for days. We don't have to disappear quietly. I called Carlos and told him I wanted to create something that would outlive the scandal, outlive me. A foundation, I said, for people like Agnes, for those who have no one left to speak for them. Carlos didn't even blink. Then let's make it happen. That's how the Clara Reynolds Foundation for Senior Protection was born. A small office at first, tucked between a legal clinic and a library. We started with 3 volunteers and a handful of donors, most of them strangers who had followed my story online. But the calls began almost immediately. Elderly men and women from across the country, people swindled by children, nephews, caregivers, neighbors, voices trembling with the same mix of confusion and shame I once felt. Some didn't even want their money back. They just wanted someone to believe them.
Within a year, we had helped over 400 seniors reclaim their finances, homes, or legal autonomy. Evelyn became our head of investigations, using her meticulous eye to unravel fraud networks. Carlos handled the legal cases pro bono, saying he owed the universe one good fight for every bad one he'd ever seen. And me? I became the face of it, reluctantly at first. Reporters wanted interviews. Magazines wanted features. People wanted to hear how an elderly widow had outsmarted her abusers. But I refused to be a victim mascot. I told them the truth. I didn't fight because I was brave. I fought because I was tired of being small in my own story. That line made headlines. It also made change. Soon, universities invited me to speak at social work programs. Law schools asked for my insight on elder abuse prevention. I wrote a book, Signed, Not Silenced, about the legal and emotional battle behind my story. To my surprise, it became a bestseller. And with every copy sold, I set aside funds to keep the foundation running. Maya, my niece, joined as media director, transforming our message into a movement. She said, "You didn't just reclaim your name, Aunt Clara. You gave people permission to reclaim theirs." The day we opened our second office, I stood outside the door with tears in my eyes. The plaque read, "The Clara Reynolds Foundation, protecting the dignity of those who protected us." I thought about the woman I used to be, quiet, accommodating, terrified of conflict. I thought about how Julia once said I was too old to start over. And yet, here I was, starting over, one survivor at a time. Sometimes, though, the past still found me. Letters from Daniel arrived once in a while, short, hesitant, never asking for money anymore, just updates about his son, my grandson, who was growing fast and curious. I never ignored those letters, but I didn't answer them either. Some wounds need silence to close. And yet, despite everything, I set up a trust fund for the boy. Not for Daniel, not for Julia, for the innocent child caught in the wreckage of adults' greed. Because if there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that revenge might bring satisfaction, but forgiveness, not for others, but for yourself, brings peace. One evening, during a televised interview, the host asked, "Clara, after all you've achieved, do you feel vindicated?" I smiled. "No," I said. "I feel useful, and that's better." Because vindication fades when applause dies down, but usefulness, helping someone find their voice again, that echoes forever. So now, every time I see an old woman walk into our foundation's office with trembling hands and a bruised heart, I see a little piece of my past self in her. And when she walks out with her head held higher, I think, maybe that's what justice really looks like. Quiet restoration, not loud revenge. Tell me, if your pain could save someone else's from theirs, would you share it? Would you turn your scars into shelter, even for strangers who will never know your name? The courthouse smelled of polished wood and tension. 3 years had passed since the night of the slap, since that flash of humiliation that shattered everything I'd built my life around.
And now, here we were again. Same son, same daughter-in-law, same family name. But everything else had changed. Julia sat at the defense table in a beige suit that tried to look modest but screamed desperation. Her once flawless posture had softened. Her confidence, that glittering cruelty, had drained into exhaustion. Daniel sat beside her, gaunt, eyes hollow, fingers twitching at his tie. They'd been charged with fraud, coercion, and elder financial abuse after the Foundation's investigative team had uncovered how they'd used me and others for years. And now the trial had become a national spectacle. Quote, "Mother betrayed by her own son leads fight for elder justice," read one headline. Another called me the woman who turned her pain into power. I hadn't come for revenge anymore. I came because stories like mine had to end somewhere. When the judge entered, the room stilled. I sat quietly, my silver hair pinned back, wearing a simple navy dress. No makeup, no theatrics, just truth. Carlos leaned over and whispered, "You ready?" I nodded. I've been ready since the day she slapped me. The prosecution began with evidence. Documents, voice recordings, bank statements. Julia had coerced several seniors into signing over property through fake caregiving contracts. Daniel had enabled her, blinded by love and greed. When my turn to testify, the courtroom hushed. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every year, every heartbreak, every lesson. "My name is Clara Reynolds," I said into the microphone, voice steady. "And I'm here because silence lets cruelty thrive." I told them everything, not with anger, but with clarity. The way manipulation hides behind kindness, how guilt becomes a leash, and how even love can be weaponized. And when I finished, the judge looked up and said softly, "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. That was remarkable." I sat down, heart trembling, but light. I had done what I came to do. 2 days later, the verdict came in. Guilty. Both of them. Julia's face crumbled, and for the first time I saw her not as my tormentor, but as a woman destroyed by her own ambition. Daniel tried to reach for me as they led them out, but the bailiff stopped him. "Mom," he called. I turned my head just once and said, "I hope you learn before it's too late." That was the last time I saw him. In the months that followed, life blossomed again, not loudly, but with purpose. The foundation received government funding, our hotline went national, legislators began working with us to draft the Reynolds Act, aimed at protecting seniors from coercive financial control. I never asked for that law to bear my name, but maybe it was fitting. Not for me, but for every person who'd ever been dismissed, disbelieved, or silenced because of their age. At our first annual gala, Carla stood on stage, gray now but smiling, and handed me an award. A simple glass plaque etched with the words, "To Clara Reynolds, for proving that justice has no expiration date." As the audience rose in applause, I looked out over the sea of faces, men, women, children, people who'd heard my story and turned it into a movement. I thought about that night at the wedding, about the laughter that followed the slap, and how it once defined me. Now it didn't hurt anymore. It just reminded me how far I'd come. Because sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you becomes the best reason to rise. That night, after the gala, I went home and sat on my porch with a cup of tea. The world was quiet again. Not empty, just calm. Fireflies blinked in the yard. Somewhere down the street, kids were laughing. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I whispered to myself, "You did it, Clara. You finally took your name back." Then I smiled, closed my eyes, and let the night carry me, not as a victim, not as a fighter, but simply as a woman who had lived. And that, I think, is the truest revenge of all, to outlive your pain and build something beautiful from it.